Okay. Well, hello and welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us on this webinar on how to get published. We have a guest speaker, Chloe Turner, library trainer at Sage, with us. He will talk to us about some tips and what the best ways is to get published with Sage, and things to think about when you're submitting your manuscript. Just first, a couple of housekeeping rules. Everybody is muted, so none of the participants will be allowed to talk. But if you have any questions, you can either use the question and answer or the chat box. We will be recording the webinar, and I'll send a link to the recording to everyone who registered or is attending, and I'll also send the slides. And yeah, we've got an hour and a half scheduled, roughly an hour for the webinar, and then 30 minutes of questions if you want to hang around and spend more time talking to Chloe or asking questions at the end. And that's everything for me. Now I'll hand you over to Chloe. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Romy. So thanks everyone for coming today. As Romy says, I'm from Sage Publishing, the library training team, and I'll be talking you through the next sort of hour or so on some advice about how to get published. Although, however, I would say that even though I am from Sage, a lot of the advice that I'm going to give you today could be applicable to any publisher that you might want to go with. So it's not necessarily Sage specific. So just to let you know what we'll be covering today, I'll be going through some different stages in the publishing process. So we'll talk about how to conduct publishable research, writing your paper, choosing the right journal, adhering to the individual journal guidelines, preparing your paper for publication, a bit about the peer review process, and then how to handle revisions and rejections. And then I've got some links as well to some additional resources that you may want to have a look at in your own time. So really, what are journals looking for, which is always a good starting point. So conducting publishable research. So make sure that the question that you're trying to answer in your research is something that's researchable and something that's interesting. Very often it can be quite tempting to sort of skip ahead without kind of properly formulating your research question. And often researchers might have to go back and refine the question kind of based on what some sort of unanticipated items that might have come up. So it's often a good opportunity at the beginning to really spend some time tightening up that question, making sure that it's not been researched before, making sure that it is sort of really focused. And you can get help with that by speaking to your supervisor and asking for any insight that they might be able to provide. Make sure that it's not been done before, or at least from a sort of different perspective. Does it make a new contribution to the area, to your particular area of interest? You can conduct a literature review to make sure you know that you've covered all angles, but also making sure that the research offers something new and makes a new contribution to the body of literature. Make sure that your methodology is appropriate. Make sure that there's a good interaction between the research question and the methods that you choose to answer that question. Some questions, such as qualitative questions that ask like why someone does something or what motivates them, that sort of question is probably best going to be answered by a qualitative data collection technique, while others might be better answered by a quantitative approach. So make sure that you're aware of how different areas are linked together and how something might affect a choice later down the line. Make sure that your data's good quality, representative and relevant. So some things to pay attention to here. Make sure that you've thought about how you might get a fair representation of the sample of your population. So consider that you know, you might be interested in a particular group of individuals that might go into the thousands. It's going to be unlikely that you'll be able to get access to all of those individuals. So make sure that you try and pick a technique that is representative, and the sample could probably be generalized across that entire population, and that really will help to maximize the validity of your data. Write up the answers when you write up the answers to your research question, make sure that you write critically and analytically and not descriptively. It can be tempting to say, this is what I found, this is how it links to everything else, but you've always got to be thinking about how it might better answer some of the body of literature that's out there before, what you might want to do differently, some of the things that you weren't able to cover due to certain constraints. Always be critical of what you've written, but also say how it contributes as well and adds that new perspective. But how do you do this? So speak to your supervisor. They're always there to help you, particularly around your research design and methodology, because they really understand that getting it right the first time is often a lot easier than having to come back and maybe tweak it because of some unanticipated problem or because you didn't spend enough time on it in the beginning. It can be really tempting just to want to sort of get on with your sort of data collection, which is often the most exciting part of doing your research, but it's always really safe and good to make sure that you have a robust research design and methodology, so that this acts as a guiding framework for anything else that you might do after that process. Communicate with your other researchers, your colleagues, other students on your course, may be able to offer experiences that they can share, such as maybe working with a particular data collection technique, or even that they might have published with a particular publisher in the past. They may be able to give you their experiences of those different areas, and that's always insightful for you and helps you to anticipate what might come up. Take advantage of your library services. Your library will always be providing an ongoing calendar of training sessions and workshops, and these can really help with designing your research projects, academic writing, so how to what to include in different sections of your research project. So, what do I need to include in the findings? What do I need to include in the methodology, for example? How to prepare your manuscript, and understanding your open accessing publishing routes. Your library will also offer databases and digital and print resources to help with your research project. For example, books on how to get published journals and other databases, including Sage journals. Looking at previously published papers, especially in your subject area, can be a really good way of getting an idea for how to structure your own paper, and also some good examples of research that has already gone through that process, so that can give you some hints and tips about how you might want to structure your research paper. So preparation and submission. So how do you sort of prepare your manuscript, and what things do you need to think about before you submit your paper? So choosing the right journal is key to acceptance. So make sure that you consider which journals do you read and cite regularly? So what journals do you sort of access in your own sort of research? If you're within the area of social sciences, for instance, are there any journals that are highly regarded? Are there any that really cover your topic in detail? Would you want to be published in that journal? Often the journals you read are going to be a good place to start in terms of looking at journals that you might want to publish in yourself. Which journals focus most closely on your field of research? So is it a very sort of niche area that would accept the type of research you're publishing, or do you think it might be more applicable to a journal that publishes more broadly in a particular subject area? So really look around for journals that publish in your field of research to get an idea for things that they've published in the past. What is the publisher's reputation? Does the publisher of the journal have a well-regarded reputation in the academic community? Do you think they'd be a good publisher to work with? And these questions are sort of related. Who is the editor and who is on the editorial board. So very often the editor of a journal might be a well-regarded faculty member in that particular area of interest. So find out a bit about what they might have published in the past. Often universities will have a link to all their sort of faculty members with a list of their publications and their research interests. It's often the editor who has the final say as to what's published in a journal. So if you kind of do some background research on that individual and make sure that the sort of topics that you're researching sort of align with the interests of the editor, again, this just opens up the possibility of your paper being published. And the same with the members on the editorial board as well. Very often on the journal's homepage, you'll be able to find out who is on the editorial board. And again, you can go and do some background research on those individuals to see what their sort of research interests are as well, because very often that will align with obviously the content published in your journal of interest to publish in. How international is the scope of the journal? Again, this can kind of tie into how international the members of the editorial board are. If your research is mainly focused on maybe a district in North America, for instance, it's maybe not going to be as much interest to a journal if it has a more sort of international scope. So it's always worth considering that, depending on the geography of your research and where that's being conducted. Do you know anyone else who has published in the journal? Again, this sort of relates back to the advice of speaking to your peers and colleagues. If anyone else has been published in that particular journal that you know, maybe that can be a good starting point for asking them about their experiences of getting published in that journal and what they had to go through and how long the process took as well. Another piece of advice that I would give you is maybe read some papers from the journal, maybe 3 or 4 that share some of the topics that you might be researching, and to get a feel for the types and structures of the paper that have been successfully published. This can be a really good way of you sort of interpreting your research and writing it up in a way that sort of masks and mirrors what has been done previously with successfully published research. And is your research funded or self-funded? Sometimes if your research is funded, there can sometimes be some stipulations or restrictions on the type of journal that you publish in. So that's worth bearing in mind if you're funded or self-funded in terms of what is required in terms of where you publish the research. So some more tips on choosing the right journal. Once you've created your shortlist of potential journals, what are their aims, scopes and subject areas? So often on journal pages, you'll be able to get an idea of the aims and scopes by reading the sort of criteria that the journals use to publish. So what are the sort of values of the journal? How widely do they publish, and what are their subject areas, and what do they cover? Are they a member of COPE? So the COPE is the Committee of Publication Ethics. It's worth noting that around 95% of journals from SAGE are registered with COPE, and COPE is a third-party body that really provides a set of standards in terms of publication ethics that journals need to adhere to before they can call themselves a member of COPE. It's a voluntary third-party membership, so if a journal has become a member of COPE, it's often a very good indication that they're an ethical journal to work with, and that they've met those sort of stringent criteria by becoming a member. What is the impact factor of the journal? So how widely read is the research? You know, an impact factor can be a good indication of the impact of the research in the journal, but there's also other factors to take into consideration. There's the SSCI, which is the Social Sciences Citation Index, and we also have the Arts and Humanities Citation Index, as well as some more specialised citation indexes that can be a good place to go if you want to get an indication of the impact of the research of a particular journal. How well ranked are they? What is their open access policy? And we'll talk a bit about some of the different open access routes and options into the slides. And how long would the process take? This can differ from journal to journal, so it's always worth thinking about that at the start of the process before you choose your journal. It's always good advice to review previous issues of each suitable journal. Do they publish your kind of work? Do you like the style of their papers and the layout? Do you think they would accept your work? So if you were on the editorial board, think critically about whether the research you want to put forward fits in with the aims and scopes of the journal, and would you accept the work if you were taking a more objective position? And what are the individual submission guidelines, and can you meet them? So each journal page will often have their own individual submission guidelines. There can be differences between things like the referencing style that they require, the font, the spacing, and even how the pages are laid out. So can you meet those submission guidelines when you submit your paper? Some journals as well might only publish original research, so perhaps if you're maybe focusing on secondary data, or if you're maybe looking to post case studies or book reviews, the journal that you want to publish in might only publish original research. So looking at those aims and scopes and the type of work that they've published before can be a good idea to make sure that your intended research fits in with that particular journal that you might be interested in. So I just want to talk a little bit now about open access publishing, and these are some kind of alternative publishing routes as opposed to the traditional subscription model. A paper that's published via open access means that the research literature is free to view by anyone in the world via the internet, and to reuse, often this can be reused with an attribution under a Creative Commons license or equivalent. At Sage, we have sort of three models of open access. The first one that we have is what we call pure gold open access publishing. So these articles are peer-reviewed, selected, and then formally published and then made available with no subscription paywalls. To be published in the pure gold route, the author would often pay something called an article processing charge, or APC, to make sure that the article was able to be viewed by anyone without having to pay to access the individual article themselves, or for their institution to have a subscription to that particular journal. So at Sage, we publish just over 1,000 journals, but around 200 of these are pure gold. We also have our mega journals such as Sage Open, and I've included a link there as well if you're interested in having a look at that. We also have what we call our hybrid journals route, and this is the practice of making articles published in traditional subscription journals freely available. So around 98% of the journals at Sage have this sort of hybrid option. So this means that some of the articles within that journal may be behind that subscription paywall, but an author may have paid an APC to make a particular article in that journal available openly. So there might be a mixture of subscription articles and open access articles in one particular journal. We then have something called green open access archiving. So this relates to the practice of archiving a version of the article somewhere other than the publisher's website, where the final version of the article is hosted. So probably the most well-known example of this might be in a university's institutional repository. And there are several different kind of iterations of an article before it gets published in its final version. And at Sage, we have quite a generous policy about different versions of an article that it might go through. And the link there on Green Open Access Archiving tells you about some of those different options that we have, depending on the stage that your article is in that overall publishing process. So the options there are really just to provide you with some things to think about, or alternative ways of publishing if you don't want to go down the sort of traditional subscription route. Now, I just want to hand over to Romy now, and she'll be talking about Sage's agreement with EIFL in terms of publishing in Sage journals.
Yes, can I just first ask you a really quick question? For your green policy,
yes.
Is there an embargo?
It depends on the journal.
Okay.
So you would always have to go to the individual journals page to see about embargoes. We also have different conditions depending on the stage of the paper. So the link on the previous slide will explain about the different stages a paper goes through, and there'll also be some advice on how to get to an individual journal's sort of policy on the embargo period.
Because it's usually the author accepted version.
Yes.
Version. Yeah. I've also have a request for you to talk a little bit more slowly. If that's okay.
Sorry. Yes, I will.
Because I have a lot of people on the call whose first language is not English, and I know you speak really clearly, but I know it's really hard to do that. I also talk fast.
That's fine.
And then I have another question that I thought we could answer just now. The question asking: is it necessary to cite a journal's paper in the journal that you're going to submit your manuscript in? So do you need to cite other articles from the same journal?
Oh, what in terms of the research that you might have covered, or in the literature review, for example?
Yeah, obviously you want to submit to a journal where you might be reading regularly, but you don't necessarily need to cite other articles in that journal.
No. But if although there's a high possibility that if you are publishing in a journal that shares the same sort of research interests as other papers, you might be citing them anyway, because. So, but it's not necessary at all, but it might just happen anyway.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That's what I thought. Thank you. Okay, so I'll speak briefly about the offer between Sage and EIFL for authors from EIFL partner countries for open access publishing. So this is for the fully open access Sage journal, so the gold open access. So Chloe said there's about 200 of those. So authors from the countries in the first list, from Botswana through to Zimbabwe, I won't read them all out, qualify for a waiver. So Chloe's talked about article processing charges that authors need to pay to make the article available in open access. So through this agreement, authors from these countries don't have to pay this. So essentially, if you submit an article, once it's accepted, it doesn't mean it's guaranteed to get accepted. Once it's accepted, you don't have to pay this APC charge, and your article will still be available in open access. The only condition is that all authors collaborating on the article need to come from one of the eligible countries listed here. So you couldn't have a collaboration with someone, say, in the United States, then it wouldn't be qualifying. But if all authors are from the same or across different countries that are listed here, this fee would be waived. And then we've got a second group of countries listed here, from Azerbaijan, Belarus, Latvia, Lithuania through to the Ukraine, where authors get a 20% discount on the article processing charge. And the conditions here are a little bit different. It doesn't have to be all authors, it needs to be the corresponding author. So it could be the corresponding author is from Lithuania, but you're collaborating with authors across the UK, the US, China, whatever, and you would still qualify for this discount. And the other thing is that your institution needs to have an active subscription to the Sage journals. So those countries marked with a star are the ones where I'm aware of there being active subscriptions. So this sounds maybe a bit complicated, but I've put a link there, EIFL.net/apc/apcs-open-access-journals. You can have a look at that, and you will find title lists as well, which journals are eligible, and just to reiterate what I've just said about which countries. And if you have any questions, my email address is on there as well. If you're not sure, then please email me. And that's everything, and I'll hand back to Chloe.
All right, thanks very much. So to dive straight back in then.
Actually,
so
sorry, I've got one question about this.
Oh yeah, sure, please.
I have a question for Andrew Jones, saying, do I mean come from, do I mean must they be a citizen? They must be affiliated with an institution in that country. So they must be like their like address would be that institution in one of those countries. So you could be of a different nationality as long as you're based in that country. I hope that's answered your question. Okay, thanks, Chloe.
Okay, so to jump straight back in then, adhering to submission guidelines. So as I've touched upon briefly, different journals have different submission rules, even if they're published by the same publisher. Each journal will make its submission guidelines publicly available, so you can check these out before you submit your paper. They're usually found on the journal website. This is just an example here from a SAGE journal, the California Management Review, and you can see along the top there that there's a section there called Submit Paper. And it's very likely that journals from other publishers will have a similar page on their individual journals as well. If you can't find them, it's very often easily found by typing in the name of the journal that you're interested in publishing in, and then just submission guidelines. And it should be fairly easy for you to be able to discover what the criteria are before you submit your paper. Most submissions are handled through some software called Scholar One or Manuscript Central. Sage uses Manuscript Central, and I've got some screenshots from inside that system actually, just to show you the types of questions and topics that you might have to submit for your paper. So writing your paper. When writing your paper, it can often be tempting to start in the chronological order that your final paper might appear in, but very often, as you may know, this is often not how it works, and you sometimes have to go back to one section, forward to another, and write in different parts as you go along, and then sort of construct it towards the end in a semblance of order. So when writing your paper, you're often going to obviously have your raw data and the things that you've found out, and then you need to digest that and put it into a presentable format. So this might be in the idea like of tables, graphs, so that your data is more easily digested by your audience. You then might write up about the methods and the results, and then discuss those results in relation to the literature that you covered in your literature review. And then you could start to say in your conclusion what your research contributes to that new body of literature or that particular topic. And then you would then maybe introduce your paper, because at that point you would know what you were covering, what some of the key findings were, what the scope of your research was in the end. And then you can then write your abstract and title. And if you kind of think about it in that way, it's almost a logical step in terms of how your paper grows. And you can often only write the beginning of your paper right at the end, because that's when you know really the shape of your research and the direction it's taken. And then when you've finished, you can then obviously put it into this more sort of logical order, which is how the typical order that you expect to publish things in, and then you can reorder it. But very often, as I say, in that writing stage, that's just not how it occurs at all. So it's worth bearing that in mind, that it's okay to do that when you're developing and writing your paper. So preparing your title and abstract. Now this is really, really important and sometimes can be overlooked by authors when they're at the stage of almost being ready to submit their paper. If you think about it, in terms of how someone else might discover your article, these the title and abstract are going to be the main ways that a reader or participant in your research is going to discover your paper, either through a search engine or a database, for instance. These are the areas that are sort of in the relevancy of your results in terms of how they're sorted. These are the two areas that are going to be key. So it's worth getting these right at this stage of submission. So the better the title of your abstract, the more your work will be able to be discovered, read, and therefore cited by other papers. And that's ultimately what you want your research to do. You want as many people as possible to read it, and hopefully if they found it useful, so that you can then become cited in someone else's paper. Research is all about the conversation between authors and the contributions that they can make, and putting your research out there is you having a conversation with other researchers in your field of interest. Consider what your audience might be searching for, so especially focus on your keywords. Choose these words carefully and test them with your own internet searches. Are you finding what you would expect? So just because you might search for a topic on one particular word, that won't necessarily mean that other people will use the same kind of search terms as you. So always bear that in mind when you're submitting your own keywords. Make sure to include keywords in your title, in your abstract if you have 3 or 4 different keywords, and throughout your paper. As I've mentioned, when a database pulls back results after you've run a search in a database or a search engine, very often it's looking at the relevancy, which is greatly calculated based on the frequency and how often your keywords appear in the paper. Obviously, you want your paper to read well, so don't just try and jam those keywords in as many times as you can, but that's it's always worth bearing in mind in terms of how your research might later be discovered. Obviously, all without losing your natural flow of language. Make sure it's punchy as well. It's worth considering these before you submit. So submitting your paper, check the submission guidelines one more time. So go and access those on the journal's page. Make sure that they adhere to all those criteria. Check your formatting and additional submissions. So make sure that it's correctly typeset using the right font, maybe double spaced, making sure that the margin sizes match up with the submission guidelines, and also additional submissions. So some journals might require that you submit one whole document, which might include your appendices or graphs and tables, for instance, but some journals might require that you submit them separately. So you might submit the main body of your research as one document, then any supporting kind of appendices as additional documents that way. So make sure that your final submission is set up in the required way. Have it proofread, so maybe you could give it to a friend or a colleague, perhaps not an expert in your field, and see if they can understand what you're trying to convey. This can be, it can be sometimes really useful to get this more objective perspective, especially from someone who's not in your area of expertise. And most importantly, only submit to one journal at a time. And now wait, but for how long? And this can really be vary depending on your subject area, depending on the journal you've chosen, and depending on a whole bunch of other criteria. So I just want to show you inside Sage Track. So Sage Track is the system Manuscript Central that we use to manage our publication process. So these are just some screenshots from within that system. So step one, you can see down the left hand side there, these are some of the different stages that you will have to go through in terms of submitting your paper. So here we've got step one, choosing your title and abstract. So it's getting you to select the type of paper there and the title that you want. And then there's also a separate box for your abstract. We've also got a section there for your cover letter. So that might be your cover letter to the editor to say what is good about your research, why you think it should be published in that journal, and how it kind of contributes and would benefit from being, and how the journal would benefit from maybe including your research. So it's really like with maybe applying for a job, it's all about sort of selling your research and sort of picking out the key points to kind of direct it towards the editor. Now we've also got a section for funding, so you can say if the research was funded by a third party. There we've got step 3, so attributes, so choosing some appropriate keywords. Again, we've got some links there to help you understand how readers discover your article and might be able to find that online. And there we've got a section after it's been submitted. So you'll register with Manuscript Central, and then you'll go through various stages. So we can see at this stage that this particular article is awaiting reviewer selection. So that would mean that the editor of that journal is trying to find some peer reviewers, and then there's loads of different stages that the article might go through. So you as the author can log in at any time and check the status of your particular journal. So that just shows you really just how sort of in-depth that process is before you even get your article submitted. So I'm going to pause there because I think I can see my chat box flying up. So Romy, is there any questions that I could answer at this stage before I go on to talk about peer review?
No, it's not actually. There was just some comments from some people who were raising their hand, and I've said to raise. There's actually one question. Kindly explain the APC. So this is the article processing charge that Chloe mentioned earlier on. So it's usually a fee that the author needs to pay in order to make the article open access.
Yes.
Covers publishing costs. And he says, how long can I wait for a response after submitting my manuscript?
That can really vary from journal to journal, and I'll go on to talk about that in a bit more detail, but it can be dependent on any number of things. One of the things can be how long would your paper take to review. If it needs to go through a lot of revisions or a lot of adaptations, that can obviously add time. If for instance you didn't kind of pay attention to the submission criteria, that's obviously going to hold up your article. Sometimes it can take a long time to find people to even review your paper. It's getting more and more challenging as people are submitting more and more research to find reviewers to review papers. So there's lots of different things that can affect how long your paper takes, but there's certainly steps that you can take as the submitting author to bring down those timeframes. And one of those obviously is making sure that you adhere to those submission guidelines, make sure that the journal you're publishing to aligns with the research you're trying to publish. So things that I've already mentioned as well, and all those things are contributing factors to how long papers can take.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm just going to talk a bit more about the peer review process. I've obviously missed out an E in process there, so I'll go back and edit that before I send out the slides. So I've just got a very kind of rough model here of the publication process. So we've got those different stages in chronological order there. And the section in the middle there, so review, revise and resubmit, is often the stage of the publication process that can take the longest. And sometimes papers can often go through 2 to 3 iterations before they're finally accepted to a journal. Now, how do you manage the peer review process? So after you submitted your paper, obviously that will be looked at by the editorial board of the journal, and then you'll be given an initial decision, and that will either be a desk reject, so an immediate rejection, there's no changes required. Often you'll get advice as to why your paper's been rejected, and often it will be related to maybe not aligning with the research interests of the journal, or not following the correct submission guidelines, for instance. Or it will be submitted for peer review. Now, the peer review process is essentially where your paper is sent out to 2 or 3 referees by an associate editor. The reviewers or referees will then write a report and make recommendations for improvement to that individual paper to the journal editor. So the peer review decision will then either be to reject the paper, accept with major revisions, accept with minor revisions, or accept and publish. It's very, very rare that a paper will be taken forward straight away and published. It's much more likely that your paper will either have to be accepted with major revisions or accepted with minor revisions. So it's worth just saying at this stage that a reject doesn't necessarily mean that your paper's a bad one. It might just not fit with the journal's objectives. It might just need the methodology section might just need tightening up. It might just it doesn't sort of contribute anything to that field of research. The analysis is poor. It might just not be well structured. So at that stage, it's worth maybe going back and working on those items before you then go and submit it to another journal. But if you've considered some of the advice that we've looked at previously, hopefully that should minimise the chances of your paper being rejected. So how do you handle revisions? So if your paper is accepted with major or minor revisions, you'll then be sent a report from the referees and maybe a summary from the editor as well, carefully explaining the areas that you might need to go back and look at to improve your paper. So read these reports carefully to kind of digest that advice. Always try and follow the time frames requested. So if they would like you to kind of adapt and rewrite sections of your paper within a couple of weeks, try and follow those time frames. They've given you those to try and fit in with a particular journal that they might have had in mind. Maybe it's a special edition. So always try and work with the editor, and again that will help minimise the waiting time that you might have to go through before your paper's finally published. Clearly demonstrate what you've changed. So sometimes these reports will come with sort of highlighted notes. Go back and respond almost to the referees and say, this is what I've changed. I hope that this better kind of demonstrates what you were trying to get me to prove. Address each referee point in a covering note, and if you can't meet all the criticisms, explain why or how you feel that it's not relevant to change in your journal. So always respond to each individual point. Try and be positive and polite. It can often be a very frustrating process. Handling criticism of any kind is never easy, and especially on something that you've worked on for so long. Often your research could have taken a number of years to even get to this stage, and it can feel frustrating to almost be there and then have to go and make some changes to your final paper. But really, the role of the editor and the editorial board is to make sure that your research is the best that it can be. So the point of the peer review process is to really make the research stand out and really kind of important and so on. So please, when you're dealing with editors, be positive and polite. Again, this can make such a big difference in terms of the relationship with your editor and in getting your paper submitted. And just so you're aware, the process can sometimes take 2 to 3 iterations. So please be patient during this process. Acceptance and rejection. So how do you handle acceptance and rejection? So what do you do if it goes right? First, celebrate. Getting to this point has often been a long haul, so make sure you celebrate with your peers and then go on to promote your paper. This is where you want to make sure that it's as discoverable as possible. So here I've just put some areas and places where you may want to kind of publicize your paper. So you could take it onto social media through places such as Twitter and Facebook, maybe try and publish it through a LinkedIn profile. You've got the option to maybe speak about it at a conference, promote on your university website if you have a section there for if the university library has a section, for example, of promoting the latest research. Sign up to researchers' profiles such as Kudos and Orchid, and if you have your own blog, maybe you could promote it there as well. So they're just some ideas about how to get your paper out into the wider world. So just some advice on why papers might get rejected. The referees might not be convinced of the contribution to the knowledge base. The methods that you use are not robust enough for that journal. So there might be too few observations on the quantitative papers, or the transparency of your qualitative methods might not be enough. So that's something worth considering when you're explaining the methods that you've chosen. Make sure that they're transparent, make sure that they could be easily replicated by someone else if they wanted to go and repeat your research. It might be that specific sections of your paper are weak. Perhaps the discussion doesn't sort of critically engage with the other research in that area. It doesn't explain how it contributes. It doesn't explain some of the pitfalls of your research, or what you might have been able to do differently with more time, and so on. So always be very clear in each of these sections. It might just have bad grammar and written style. So there are a number of reasons why a paper might get rejected. If your paper is rejected, stay calm. That's probably the most important thing. Read the referee's report and editor's letter. This is going to be the best place to kind of go to kind of overcome some of those challenges that you might have found that have come up with your paper. Try and rework the paper according to their recommendations. And if you aren't happy with some of the things that have been mentioned in the report, maybe consider submitting to an alternative journal. You have the absolute right as the author of that paper to kind of pull your paper from a particular journal if you're not happy with the process, or how long it's taking, or the relationship that you have with the editor. You can pull your paper out at any time. So maybe if you're not happy with anything that you've been presented with, you might want to consider submitting to an alternative journal. So you could maybe go back to your final list that you might have started at the beginning of the process when you were considering which journal might be the right one to submit to. But it's worth bearing in mind that you may need to reformat the paper to fit in with the new journal's requirements. And potentially you might want to just start again and write an entirely different paper from a different perspective. It's worth bearing in mind that it doesn't mean it's a bad paper. It might have just been submitted to the wrong journal and not fit in with their aims and scopes. So again, go back to that original sort of shortlist and see if your paper better aligns with the aims and scopes of another journal. We also have a service at Sage called Sage Path. So this is a service that we can provide if, for instance, your your article was rejected from one journal, we can recommend other journals that you might want to submit to or publish in, so you're not left alone at that stage. So roles and responsibilities. So these are the different roles and responsibilities that authors and editors and the publisher has in the publication process. So what are your responsibilities as the author? Your professional ethics as a researcher is searching for the truth and searching for answers. So don't make any attempts to, don't try to distort your research or make it appear in a certain way if it doesn't actually appear that way from your findings. Always provide an accurate and professional account of the research and the relevance to others. So you can do this by providing clear, concise communication. You'll have a responsibility as an author to the commitment of the public good and public values, even though there can be intense competitive pressure in research. Always respect your peers and to the public, and make sure you respect issues such as privacy and confidentiality in your research. So if your research does involve vulnerable individuals, for instance, or sensitive information, always be aware of protecting anonymity in your research. So there's some of your responsibilities of the author. We also have, as I've mentioned, copyright and publishing ethics. Always obtain permission for all copyrighted material. Provide full acknowledgement of an authorship of research that you might be citing. Always kind of be open about your funding. Always be aware of any conflicts of interest that you might have, and the research ethics. So as I've mentioned, we have COPE, and I've got a link there to COPE's website, publicationethics.org. So that will lay out some of those criteria that any journal who's a member of COPE has to adhere to if they want membership of that kind of third party. So the responsibilities of the publisher. So as a publisher, we have to make sure that our journals are sustainable over time, that they're meeting new kind of areas that might be emerging in terms of topics of interest going forward, making sure that they're good value for money, making sure that the journals are quality, and also that the editors and editorial boards are well respected researchers in that particular area, or faculty members. Make sure that the relevance of the journal kind of adapts as the field develops. So that's managing the aims and scopes of the journal, making sure that the research papers are disseminated as widely as possible. So assisting with keywords, search terms, making sure that the taxonomies in the databases are up to date and are able to link with third-party vendors. Also uphold the ethical values of the publication as well. So we've got author rights here in the digital age. The copyright situation can be much more complex. Funders may require authors to make their papers available in repositories. So that can sometimes be at odds with the publisher requirements, and it's often up to the individual author to make sure that your paper is posted in the right place. And obviously, as we've seen, different publisher policies can vary, as well as individual journal policies varying as well. So if you're unsure, just ask. The publisher will be more than happy to assist with any questions you have here. So next steps, just to sort of summarise what we've talked about, make sure that your methodology quality is really key to the publishing criteria. We want to make sure that original research is robust and transparent, so that it's easily understood and interpreted by your readers. Make sure you have something worthwhile to say, make sure that it contributes to the field of research you want to publish in, make sure that it answers a new perspective. Find the right journal to say it in, make sure that your research aligns with the aims and scopes of the journal, that it aligns with previously published papers and subject areas. Read articles from your chosen journal to get a sense of what they publish. Ask a friend or colleague or peer to proofread your work before submission. Friends and colleagues can often give some quite honest advice about how to make some improvements, so it's always worth tapping into these resources if they're available to you. Find the specific submission guidelines and follow them completely. If you do follow them to the letter before you submit your paper, as I've mentioned, this can go some way to reducing the waiting time before your paper is published. Submit to only one journal at a time, and most importantly, take any feedback constructively and not personally. The aim of any research journal should be to only publish the most academically rigorous and original and contributing research out there. So any advice or feedback they provide is really with that ultimate aim in mind. So on the next slide, I've just provided some resources that might be able to help you get additional help and support. Your colleagues, faculty in the library are always going to be a great kind of first point to get help and advice from. We've got a campaign here called Think Check Submit, so that's a link there designed to help researchers follow best practice during the submission process. We've got an area here, Sense About Science, and this page offers a load of really great free resources to help scientists ensure their work is academically rigorous and reaches the widest possible audience. And Sage also has a nice area on our corporate site called the Journal Author Gateway, and that provides a lot of tips on improving your chances of publication. But the advice is generalizable, so you can also go onto that page as well to get some more general advice that would be applicable to submitting to other journals or publishers as well. So that's a great free resource that you can access if you wanted to get some additional tips there. I've also included a link here. This paper is openly available, so you can go and access to it. You can go and access it even if you don't have a subscription to Current Sociology, which is a Sage journal. And this is a paper written by the author here, Eloisa Martin, and she's talking about, she's the former editor of this journal, Current Sociology, and she's talking about how to write a good article. And I think it's just quite nice to include because she's writing it from the perspective of an editor. So I've kind of been talking from the perspective of a publisher, but this article might just provide an alternative viewpoint from the perspective of the editor. So you can go and have a look at that paper as well. And that really sort of rounds up the presentation today. It was a lot of information to get through, but I really hope that it's given you some things to think about when publishing your own paper, and some additional resources as well that you might want to go and explore. We've got about half an hour left, so if you need to kind of go and get on with meetings or any additional tasks, please feel free. But I'm also going to be here for the next half an hour or for as long as I'm needed to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Thanks, Chloe. We do have quite a few questions that have come up. I didn't want to interrupt you.
No, it's fine, please.
Allocated anywhere in your flow. So I'm looking at the chat first, and then I'll look at the Q&A. Do journals require proof of IRB, Institutional Review Board, or does it vary by journal?
Institutional Review Board, sorry, is that?
Yeah.
Oh, I've never heard of an institutional review board, actually, so I don't really think I can answer that. But again, huh?
We'll try and find out.
Yeah, we'll try and find out. So whoever has answered that question, I will try and find out for you. But my first guess would be, like with most of my answers to things, is that it will vary from journal to journal. But I've never heard of an institutional review board, so I will go and do some additional research on that with my colleagues and see if we can answer that more robustly for you.
And then we have, can you elaborate on what you mean by sustainability? I think this was in relation to the sustainability of journals.
So that sort of means, like, how can they remain relevant to sort of the changing environment? So how people are accessing research, whether that's through databases, whether that's through the paper, through sort of paper journals. So making sure that they sort of remain sustainable going forward. How sort of what topic areas that they cover, making sure that they may remain relevant to areas sort of as they change going forward. So that's sort of what I mean by the sustainability of journals. It's making sure, in a nutshell, that they may remain relevant to the environment and in the areas that they're publishing in, and in the sort of changing environment of research.
Thanks. Please explain the role of a corresponding author and agencies.
A corresponding author, I mean, I can take a guess at that, but again, that'd probably
I can take that if you want.
Yes, please, please.
It would be the author that is submitting the paper and is corresponding with the publisher on behalf. So you might collaborate. So you might have an article where 5 people have collaborated on it together, and the corresponding author is the one who's in touch with the publisher. He will look at the peer review and who will, usually pay the APC if it's open access. And that was, I guess, in relation to the offer. About agencies, I'm not sure how agencies would be involved in the whole submission process. Perhaps there's some third-party companies that offer help to authors.
Yeah, I think it depends what you mean by an agency, because it could be a funding agency. It could be if your research is being funded by a private company, they may have certain criteria that they would like you to kind of adhere to in that submission process. But that would also, if there are any agencies involved, in terms of their funding or how their research aligns with them, they would always be very clear about that. So it's worth going back to any agency that you're sort of collaborating with or doing research on behalf of to see what particular guidelines they have, or you might have to adhere to when you're choosing a journal to publish in.
Then we have a question from Felicity. Besides the APC, can my article be published free of charge if not open access? Yes, if you publish it in a subscription journal, you don't need to pay to publish it. You don't get paid either. The institutions would need to pay to access it. How about open access? Is there a common kind of search browser for all search publications? I think you've got like a link to all your open access journals.
Yes, so we've got a link to the open access journals. I think there was a link on the slide that took us through to all the open access journals at Sage. If there isn't, I can easily add one in. So I'll add that into the slides before we send them on, so you can see a full list of all the journals that are the gold ones anyway, because about 98% of the journals at Sage are follow that hybrid model. But I know there is that information available. I'll make sure that it's included on the slides for you before I send those on.
What do you do when 2 reviewers make contradictory comments?
That's a very good question. So at that stage, hopefully, say if you've got 2 reviewers who've made the contradictory comments, that hopefully should have been picked up by the editor before they send on their editor's letter. If for whatever reason they've missed it, editors are fallible, you would probably have to go to the editor and say, politely, and say, hello, there's some conflicting advice here. Can you please go back to the reviewers and sort of, you know, be a bit more clear on which advice I need to follow. So yeah, just sort of pass it back to the editor, yeah, and just sort of, yeah, be constructive and polite in your response, and just ask which is the best way forward and which sort of route you need to take.
Mm-hmm. Then we have a question here. Can you clarify how Sage can help me find a different journal? I didn't see the link or website for that service.
Okay, so we have a service called Path, and this is a service that's offered to you after you may have submitted to a Sage journal, and for whatever reason your paper might have been rejected. So this is a service that we provide through our editors who work on those different journals. I can include a link to Sage Path in there if you want, but really it's just the editors of those journals looking at other journals that might have similar research interests or a similar scope and guidelines, and then the editors at Sage can then help you maybe choose a journal that might better align with your research. Also as well, the editor who helps you choose obviously will have been involved in that sort of publication process and be quite knowledgeable about perhaps why your paper was rejected. So they can use some of those reasons perhaps to help them inform any decisions they make when they suggest alternative journals to you. Again, we do have some links on our corporate site that explain more about Sage Path. But that's essentially what that service is, and that would be offered to you only after a paper might have been rejected. It's really just to sort of make sure that we capture all good research, because a lot of the time the reason research is rejected is that it just maybe needs tweaking, or it just doesn't fit in with the aims and scopes of the journal, and we don't want good research falling through the net just because it might not have been appropriate for that journal. So that's when we would sort of step in and help with that Sage Path service.
Okay, thanks. We have 4 more questions. Another one just popped up. After rejection, is it possible to submit to another journal the exact same text that was rejected?
If your paper, I think it depends on why your paper was rejected from the original journal. If it was rejected from the original journal because it had maybe bad grammar or bad structure, it's very likely that submitting to another journal is probably going to come back with the same criticisms. However, if it was just that perhaps it doesn't contribute to the field of knowledge that that journal covers, then that simply might be the reason why it was rejected. So you might not have to make any changes. I think it depends on the reasons why your paper was initially rejected. So that would be where really sort of paying close attention to the referee's comments and the editor's letter can be really good at you sort of understanding and ascertaining why your paper was rejected. So that's always worth bearing in mind before you submit it to an alternative journal. It might just be that you might just need to make small changes and then submit it, but it's obviously worth bearing that in mind. And it's largely based on the reasons why your paper was rejected in the first place as to whether you'd need to make any changes.
Great. Then we have a request to send instructions of how to submit to a paper, but I think that was covered in the slides.
Yeah, so that would be going to submit paper on the journal's homepage. All of the Sage journals have that similar layout. Obviously, that layout might be a little bit different depending on the publisher or the journal. But as I say, if you type in the name of the journal into a search engine and then submission guidelines, it's very likely that you'll get a hit that will take you straight through to that page. And if you can't find them, obviously, just email the publisher, and hopefully they should be able to point you in the right direction.
Then you mentioned that we should celebrate and promote a published article at conferences. Should we make any major changes? Should it not be the same or too similar? Can it be the exact same?
Yeah, yes, it can be the exact same, but again, always bear in mind sort of publisher guidelines and restrictions on how you sort of maybe rewrite that research. Sometimes a publisher might say you can't drastically change sections of your research, so do bear that in mind if you maybe want to rewrite that for sort of conference proceedings, for instance. So always, always check if you want to make major changes. It might be that you just want to sort of make your summarize your research rather than having a whole paper. So always check with the publisher. And again, always check the submission guidelines of the conference. They might have a particular structure that you might need to follow. So essentially, if in doubt, just check with your publisher. Very often they're quite generous when it comes to promoting research at a conference, because that helps to just disseminate the research more widely. So just check if you're in doubt. The information's usually very easy to find.
Okay. If we submit to all SAGE publications, can I know what is the minimum and maximum APC charge? I don't know if that's something you'd know off the top of your head.
The average, it depends again. It depends on the journal. An average APC charge can range from about $2,000 American dollars, but it can be higher and it can be lower, and it just depends on the individual journal. That's around about the average. But again, as I say, it can depend on the journal you're submitting to, and also things like APC waivers, the agreement you've got with EIFL. So it can all depend on things like that as to how much it costs. So again, it varies from journal to journal, but on average, it's about $2,000.
Okay. Can I resubmit a rejected article to the same journal after corrections? Yes, you can resubmit, right?
Yes, if you want to.
Yeah.
In short.
If we choose green, can we upload the article to another place? For example, our profile. Yes. The author accepted version of the manuscript.
Yeah,
we have to check the contract, right? Bill?
Yeah, so there's different, as I've mentioned, there's different stages that an article would go through. So there's there's your original paper that you first submit to a journal, then it goes through processes of revision, and then there's the final version, which has gone through that process of typesetting, so it fits into the structure of the journal, so it's presented in the same way, and very often there's a lot more restrictions on the sort of final published article as it would appear on the journal's website than there is to sort of previous iterations of a paper. SAGE sort of lay out those different stages of the paper on the link that I provided there to the green sort of archiving open access kind of option. And it tells you exactly what you can and can't do with different versions of your paper. Very often, with the first submitted version of your article, you can put that straight into the institutional repository because it's not been through that process of peer review. It's not been checked for academic rigor. So it's really dependent on the version of the article that you want to put into your institutional repository. Sometimes with different journals there can be what we call an embargo period, so that means that you have to wait a certain time period before you can post the final version of your article in other places other than the journal's website. But again, that varies from journal to journal and subject area to subject area, but those sort of restrictions will obviously be made clear after you submit the journal and it's published, and on the journal's website as well. So we explain on that sort of green link different stages of a kind of paper that it goes through, and generally what you can do with it and where you can post it. So hopefully that might help.
Thanks, Chloe. So I've got some questions. They're coming in. There's a question from Kinchu Wayne. How can I know which conference is the best to submit papers?
Conferences, again, just look at the kind of breadth of what that conference is publishing in. Often they might have a particular topic that they're focused on that year. See if so in the call for papers from a conference, they'll say we're really interested in papers that are contributing to this particular subject area, that are answering from this perspective, for instance. And often those criteria, you can see if they align with any research that you have published or are currently involved with. And if you think it is, obviously you can submit your wish to be sort of present at that conference to talk about your research, and then the organisers of the conference will check to see whether your research would be interesting to people attending that conference, and it sort of fits in with the topic that they're covering of that year. Very often conference websites will be very clear about the things that they're interested in talking about that year. So again, it's like the aims and scopes of a journal. Just see if your research fits in with the aims and scopes of that particular conference.
Okay, another question. You mentioned including keywords in the title. Is that a common rule?
I wouldn't say it was a common rule. I wouldn't say it's something you necessarily had to do, but again, it's thinking about how databases order and retrieve and kind of harvest metadata to bring forward search results when you look for items on a database, for instance. So if you, as an end user or as a reader of research, go to a database, type in your area or kind of topics that you want to find articles on, you type those in, and then the database will bring back results based on the relevancy of your search terms. Now, relevancy is quite a complicated topic to sort of break down, but it can be largely based on the frequency of how often your keyword search terms appears, either in the full text of the document and also where they appear as well. So often it will look at the title and the abstract, and papers that contain the keywords in those areas are likely to be higher up in the search results after someone's ran their search in a database or search engine, for instance. So it's not necessarily a rule. It's all about how your paper is going to be best discovered. And if you do notice that similar research contains particular keywords, it's often worth bearing that in mind when you are thinking about the title and the keywords and the abstract that you want to associate with your paper. If you're getting back, if you want your research to align with a particular body of literature, look at those keywords that they have used and see how they've deployed them, because very often that can give you a good idea about how they have made their papers discoverable in search engines and databases. So it's certainly not a rule, but it's also worth bearing in mind in terms of how other people will finally discover your paper when it's published.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we have another question from Felicita. Does the article get the same visibility if submitted in a repository? Please tell us the difference. If I submit it in my university repository, will it be necessary to publish in a journal? So it's not either or, I would say. You publish it in a journal and then you might be allowed to also put it in your institutional repository. But I would say in terms of open access, you don't get the same visibility through an institutional repository than you do through an open access journal.
Yeah, very often a institutional repository will just be managed sort of at the individual university level, and they just, you know, a publisher like Sage has so many people dedicated to making sure that the journal platform is you know, fit for purpose. It has all the necessary links, really good metadata. We also have a really wide reach in terms of our reputation as a publisher, which is obviously just a lot bigger. We have a lot more scope than maybe than the individual university would have in terms of publicising the research of their authors. You know, I would say try and publish and try and get your work out in as many places as you can. The more places you can put it, the more widely, the more people are likely to discover it. And it can also depend on any number of ways that your university may have set up the institutional repository. There are lots of third-party sort of harvesters that will go to institutional repositories and harvest the metadata there. So I think it's the Directory of Open Access Journals. You can run searches from there, and they cover things like institutional repositories. And if you have good metadata and open metadata associated with your institutional repository and article, that is obviously just going to widen the scope even further than if someone was just going to go to your own institutional repository. So that's all worth bearing in mind if you do submit to an institutional repository.
And usually, even though it's restricted to the author accepted version of the manuscript, you're allowed to use the DOI and the metadata of the final version.
Yes.
So it becomes more discoverable, and even Google Scholar would find it that way. But I think overall, I would still say it's less discoverable and less visible than if you do it full gold open access.
100%. But it's just worth bearing in mind when you do your research into the different options in terms of where you publish. But almost 100% of the time, publishing to a journal is going to give you the widest audience.
We have a question related to this. Are all SAGE journals needed to choose open access? No, there are subscription journals, hybrid journals in which you can publish without paying an open access fee, and then the article is not an open access. And then a question for Myanmar: can you send a free open access journal site for Myanmar country? I think you will. I think you qualify for the waivers. So if you look at the EIFL, if you look back at the slides, the slide about the waivers, there was a link in there that would take you to the page where you can see which journals you would be eligible for. I can send that again as well. Then we have another question from Dusan. If you presented some of the results at a conference previously, like a poster, does that affect the possibility of the journal publication in the future?
Not necessarily, because if you're just publishing the sort of research from the journal, again, that's not the final published article. That's like a previous sort of iteration of your research. So no, it wouldn't really affect.
You could do a conference both after you've published an article or beforehand.
Yeah.
Okay. That looks like we've cleared all the questions. It's really good getting so many questions. Very good. But yeah, I think that's it, because nothing else has come in, and we're coming up to 20 past 11 here anyway. So I think we'll wrap up. There was one question someone asked: will we provide written answers to all the questions? And I said that we didn't plan to do this, but obviously if you're looking at the slides and there's something you remember that you want to add on that clarifies, feel free to do that, Chloe, but I wasn't planning to type up all the questions and answers.
No, I mean, everything's recorded, so if you do want to go back, you can just listen to the answers. I have got a few links that I'll add into the slides, just a list of open access journals, the gold ones, and a link to some more information about the Sage Path service. So I'll certainly add those in, but most of the links will hopefully answer any additional questions. My email address is on the screen there, and so is Romy's. So if you do have any other questions, please feel free to contact us. We'll be more than happy to help. And thank you for coming. I really appreciate your time this morning and bearing with us right till the very end of the presentation.
And thank you so much, Chloe. I will get the final version of the slides from you, and I will email everybody who was here or who registered and couldn't make it, and I will send you the link to the recording as soon as it's available, as well as the slides. Lots of you sent individual messages. Please email this address, but I'm just going to take everyone because that's too much work adding them all in individually. But thank you. And I think that's it. Thanks so much.
All right, thanks guys. Cheers, bye.